A trucker picks up a pregnant woman hitchhiking at night, but what he does along the way will leave you speechless. Sharon had always been a fighter. From an early age, she learned that the world offered no guarantees or support. She lost her parents while still young, and there were no relatives to take her in. Solitude became her only certainty, and survival became her only choice. She didn't have an easy childhood, nor anyone to guide her along the way. She worked from a young age, facing hard days, constant struggles, and the exhaustion of not being able to count on anyone. Still, she never gave in to bitterness. The world could be cruel, but Sharon never stopped being kind. Her heart, even marked by pain, remained strong. She was resilient. She kept going without complaining, facing every blow of fate with serenity, because giving up was never an option. When love came, Sharon felt for the first time that maybe she wouldn't be alone anymore. After so much fighting, she believed that finally she would have someone by her side. But that hope crumbled the moment she found out she was pregnant. The man who claimed to love her disappeared without hesitation, leaving her to face everything alone once again. The blow was hard, but Sharon didn't crumble. She kept working, saving every penny to ensure a dignified future for the child she was carrying. She fought as much as she could, but when the weight of the advanced pregnancy prevented her from going on, she had to stop. Now, all that was left was to wait. That night, Sharon couldn't find peace. Since the beginning of the day, a strange discomfort had accompanied her, a subtle but persistent feeling that made her stop for brief moments to take a deep breath. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself it was just accumulated fatigue. The past few months had been exhausting, and the weight of the pregnancy made everything harder. There were still a few weeks left until the birth, and she believed her body was just complaining due to the excessive effort of the last few days. But as the hours went by, that unease began to turn into something different. Sitting on the edge of the bed, Sharon ran her hands over her face and closed her eyes. She felt sweat gathering on her neck, her breathing slightly quickened. A bothersome pressure appeared in her lower abdomen, something that made her arch her back reflexively. It wasn't just discomfort. She slowly got up, walking to the small kitchen to pour herself a glass of water. With each sip, she tried to push away the concern. Maybe it was just the baby moving more than usual. "It'll pass," she murmured to herself, trying to believe. But it didn't pass. The pain returned, stronger this time, forcing her to lean on the table. Her chest rose and fell in an irregular rhythm as she waited for the sensation to subside. When it finally did, she straightened up and went back to the bedroom. She needed to rest. If it was fatigue, sleep would help. She lay down, carefully adjusting her belly and closing her eyes. But sleep didn't come. The discomfort returned in waves, each one more noticeable. First, a pressure, then a tightness. Next, a sharp pain that made her hold her breath for a moment. "No, it can't be time yet," she whispered, trying to convince herself. But her body told a different story. The contractions started out spaced, enough for her to try to deny them, but soon they became frequent enough to ignore. Her breathing sped up with each new wave of pain. Sweat ran down her temples, her body tensed, and every moment became a battle against the inevitable reality. The baby was coming early, and she wasn't ready. She gripped the edge of the bed, feeling panic creep into her thoughts. She couldn't go into labor here alone. But what could she do? She didn't have a phone. The hospital wasn't close. There was no one to ask for help. Her heart pounded in her chest. She needed to find a way. Struggling, she got up, holding her belly as another intense contraction hit. Slow steps, short breaths, her body heavy. Every movement felt like an effort beyond human strength. Still, she didn't hesitate. She grabbed a thin coat, put on her shoes, and ignoring the growing pain, she went out. The night wind wrapped around her as soon as she stepped onto the deserted road. The night silence seemed to mock her urgency. She stretched out her hand, hoping a car would pass. The pain returned, forcing her to bend slightly. She gasped, feeling the sweat trickle down her face. "Someone, please," she whispered, feeling the desperation seep in. Lights appeared in the distance. Sharon raised her hand again, her heart pounding with hope. But the car passed by without slowing down. Another came. It didn't stop either. Tears stung her eyes, but she held them back. She couldn't give in to panic. Her son needed her to be strong. The pain intensified, and Sharon gritted her teeth, determined not to give up. Another car passed, then another. Nothing. That's when the deep rumble of an engine echoed down the road. A truck was approaching slowly. Her heart pounded in her chest. She stretched out her hand one last time, holding her breath. For a moment she feared it would drive past as well. But then the sound of brakes tore through the silence, and Sharon felt her heart race with expectation. The truck door opened with a creak, and a man stepped out. He approached without haste, steady steps, attentive eyes. His face was marked by time on the road, but he carried a serenity that made her hesitate for a moment. "Is everything all right, Mom?" he asked in a calm tone, not rushing but observant. Sharon opened her mouth to answer, but the pain came first. A strong contraction made her hold her breath for a moment. She forced herself to hide it, closing her eyes for a second before slowly exhaling. She couldn't tell him the baby was coming. She didn't want to scare him, didn't want him to hurry or worry. "I need to get to the hospital," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. The man raised an eyebrow slightly but showed no surprise. "Did you hurt yourself?" he asked, quickly scanning her, looking for any visible signs. Sharon forced a small smile, even with sweat dripping from her temple. No injury, just some discomfort. The doctors asked me to go if I felt something unusual." He watched her for a moment as if pondering her words. Then he nodded. "All right. Can you get in by yourself? Or do you need help?" She wanted to say she could manage, but another tightening in her belly made her hesitate. She took a deep breath, nodding slowly. "Maybe a little help." He didn't ask questions. He just stepped closer and extended his hand. Sharon took hold of him, feeling the firmness of his touch, and with effort managed to get into the cab. Once settled in the seat, she let out a long sigh. The discomfort was still there, but at least now she was on her way. The trucker closed the door and walked around, getting in on the other side. He started the engine with a familiar motion, adjusting the mirrors before beginning the drive. "My name's Jason," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Sharon," she replied, keeping one hand on her belly, trying to look as natural as possible. Jason didn't respond immediately, just drove the truck forward, the engine humming softly against the quiet night. Sharon kept her gaze fixed on the road, biting her lip to contain any reaction as a new wave of pain threatened to overtake her. She had to hold on. She had to appear normal. She wasn't ready for what was coming, but now at least she wasn't completely alone. The truck continued down the road at a steady pace, the engine purring gently through the night silence. Jason drove without haste, maneuvering the vehicle with the assurance of someone who knew every curve of the route. The initial silence between them was filled only by the sound of the tires gliding over the asphalt, the faint rustle of the wind entering through a crack in the window. Sharon kept her head against the seat, trying to appear calm, though her body betrayed the effort to remain serene. She took a deep breath and glanced briefly at the trucker beside her. She didn't want to seem anxious, didn't want him to suspect what was happening, so she forced herself to act casually. "Been on the road long?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Jason gave her a quick look before returning his attention to the road. "Since I can remember," he answered. Sharon forced a smile. "Sounds like a tiring job." He shrugged. "It has its days, but the road has its good side. I like the silence, the freedom. I'm not the type who likes to stay in one place." She nodded slightly, absorbing those words. The cold wind entered through the crack in the window, and she pulled her coat tighter around herself. "Do you travel a lot?" she asked. "Constantly." Jason let out a low laugh. "I've lost count of how many cities I've seen, how many people I've met for a moment and never saw again. The road is like that, full of meetings and goodbyes." Sharon lowered her eyes. That thought hit her in a way she didn't expect. She had always lived like that, crossing paths with people who came and went, stayed for a while, and then disappeared. "And don't you miss home?" she asked, feeling a genuine curiosity. He sighed, as if that was a thought he'd carried for a long time. "Sometimes. I have my wife, 2 young kids. They're always waiting for me when I get back." For a moment, Sharon remained silent. The idea of someone waiting for her, of having a home to go back to, seemed too distant. "That must be nice," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jason noticed her hesitation and frowned slightly. "And you?" he asked, glancing at her quickly. "Is there anyone waiting for you?" She smiled faintly, but there was no humor in her expression. "No," she simply replied. The trucker seemed to consider it for a moment before continuing. "And your family?" She took a deep breath, feeling a knot tighten in her chest. "I don't have any." He didn't respond right away, but his expression changed. Jason wasn't a man of many words, but he had learned to listen to more than just what people said. "I grew up alone," she finally said, after a long silence. "I didn't have parents for long. No siblings, uncles, cousins. It was always just me." Jason kept his eyes on the road, but his attention was on her. "That sounds hard," he said quietly. She let out a low laugh, without humor. "It was the only life I knew." The silence stretched on for a few moments. Then Jason asked in a softer tone, "How was it? I mean, how did you manage?" Sharon leaned back slightly, feeling exhaustion weigh heavily on her shoulders. "I had to learn how to take care of myself from a young age. I worked a lot. I never got to choose what I wanted to do. I just did what I had to do to keep going." Jason nodded but didn't say anything. He just waited. She sighed. "The truth is, I never stopped. I never had a moment to think about what I wanted for myself. I just kept going. Always." The trucker looked at her again. "And now?" She laughed quietly, without desire. "Now? I don't know." Jason tilted his head slightly, deep in thought. "And the father of your child?" The question was direct but not rude. Sharon swallowed hard. "He left as soon as he found out I was pregnant." Jason scoffed quietly, shaking his head. "Men like that don't deserve to be called men." She smiled without humor. "I should have known better than to expect anything from anyone." Jason tightened his grip on the wheel. "But that hurt, didn't it?" She turned her gaze to the window, biting her lip for a moment. "This time, yes. Because for the first time, I thought I wouldn't have to face everything alone." The truck continued on, cutting through the darkness of the road. The silence hung between them again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if, somehow, Jason understood. Then he murmured, almost as if speaking to himself, "Now you're not alone." Sharon blinked, surprised. She turned to face him, but Jason kept his eyes fixed on the road. "Your baby will have you," he continued, "and you'll have him." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made her feel a lump in her chest. She breathed deeply, as if trying to absorb that truth. "Yeah," she murmured, not quite sure what she was feeling. But in that moment, for the first time in a long time, she felt a little less alone. Minutes passed, and the conversation flowed in an unexpectedly natural way. Jason told her about his travels, about the cities he had visited, about the encounters and goodbyes that were part of his routine. He spoke of his wife, his young kids who eagerly waited for his return, the nights when he missed home, but also the pleasure of being on the road. Sharon listened, absorbing every word as though it were a temporary refuge for her restless mind. But as time went on, something began to change. The pain returned, now more intense, impossible to ignore. Her body stiffened, muscles tense as she tried to suppress any expression of suffering. She bit her lip. No, not yet. I have to hold on a little longer. But the contractions started coming stronger, closer together. Her breathing became irregular. She felt the sweat running down her forehead, her vision blurring for a moment. She tried not to show it, tried to continue the conversation as if nothing was happening. Jason, however, noticed. "Are you okay?" he asked, casting her a concerned look. Sharon forced a weak smile. "Yeah, just a little pain." He narrowed his eyes. "That doesn't seem like just discomfort." She opened her mouth to respond, but then a wave of pain made her shrink involuntarily. Her fingers gripped the seat tightly, her breathing quickened. Jason frowned. "Sharon." She swallowed hard. Her vision became blurry from the tears she tried to hold back. "I think my baby is coming," she finally said, her voice trembling, barely audible. Jason's face became serious immediately. "Why didn't you say anything earlier?" She breathed deeply, trying to hold back the panic. "I didn't want to bother you." He scoffed, shaking his head. "Bother? You're having a baby in the middle of the road, Sharon." She tried to laugh, but all that came out was an exhausted sigh. "Sorry." Jason didn't hesitate. He pressed his foot on the accelerator and the truck roared down the road. "Hold on tight," he said, his eyes fixed ahead. "We'll get there in time." Sharon barely had time to react before feeling the truck shoot down the road. The engine roared like a beast awakening, and the cab vibrated slightly with the force of acceleration. Jason held the wheel firmly, eyes locked on the road, his jaw clenched in concentration. The speedometer quickly climbed. He ignored any speed limits, any traffic rules, as if every second could make the difference between life and death. Sharon felt her body pressed against the seat, with every turn made with almost surgical precision. "Jason," she tried to say something, but the pain cut off her words. Her breath was caught for a moment before she let out a muffled groan. "I know," he responded quickly, without taking his eyes off the road. "Hold on, we're almost there." Almost there? It didn't seem like it. Each kilometer felt like an eternity. The world passed by like a blur through the windows. The truck's headlights illuminated the path ahead, but everything seemed to be moving too quickly. In the distance, a sign indicated a sharp turn. Any other driver would slow down. Jason didn't. "Hold on," he warned. The truck cut through the intersection like thunder splitting the sky. Other drivers honked in fear, but Jason didn't reduce his speed for a second. Finally, the hospital signs appeared. "We're here," he exclaimed, and Sharon let out a gasp of relief mixed with pain. Jason turned sharply into the hospital entrance, the truck skidding slightly before stopping abruptly in front of the emergency entrance. Before even turning off the engine, he was already opening the door and jumping out of the cab. "I need help here," he yelled to the nearby nurses. Sharon felt her body give in to exhaustion. Her vision was blurry, the sounds around her muffled as if submerged. People gathered around, hands touched her, voices called her name. A nurse leaned in close. "Can you move?" she asked urgently. Sharon tried to speak, but all she managed was a weak nod. "We'll get you on a stretcher," someone said. In a few moments, she felt her body being lifted and laid on the cushioned surface. Her hands trembled, her eyes searched for Jason in the midst of the chaos. He was there, beside her, panting, but never leaving her side. "It'll be okay," he said, his voice softer than before. She tried to say something, but another contraction stopped her. Her face twisted in pain, and the nurses began pushing the stretcher into the hospital. Jason followed, but one of the nurses raised her hand. "Sir, we need you to wait," she said firmly. He hesitated, his eyes fixed on her. Sharon looked at him, and for a moment, everything around her faded away. "Thank you," she whispered, too tired to say anything else. Jason nodded, and then the delivery room door closed behind her. Time seemed to drag. Jason paced back and forth in the waiting room, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze locked on the door through which Sharon had been taken. The hospital was quiet at that hour of the night, except for the hurried steps of the nurses walking up and down the halls. He tried sitting, but he couldn't. His foot tapped rhythmically on the floor, impatient. He had never felt like this before. It wasn't his wife in there, it wasn't his child, but somehow he felt like he was part of it. Each minute felt like an eternity. He looked at the clock on the wall, then at the door, then at the doctors who passed by without giving him any news. "Come on, Sharon," he murmured to himself. A nurse sitting nearby noticed his restlessness and smiled slightly. "Is it your first child?" she asked. Jason blinked, surprised by the question. "Oh, no, I'm not the father." The woman raised an eyebrow. "But you seem more nervous than one." He didn't know how to respond. He just sighed and looked back at the door. Time continued to drag on. He rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the weight of worry on his shoulders. What if something went wrong? Then the sound echoed down the hallway. A cry. First weak, then growing stronger, Jason froze in place. The sound traveled through the hospital like a vibrant melody, bringing relief and emotion all at once. Soon after, a doctor appeared at the door. "Mr. Jason," he stepped forward anxiously. "Yes, how is she?" The doctor smiled. "The baby was born, healthy and strong, and the mother is fine." Jason let out a deep sigh, feeling the tension drain from his muscles. His chest rose and fell quickly, as if he had just allowed himself to breathe. "Can I see her?" he asked. "Of course, but only for a moment. She's exhausted." He nodded quickly and followed the doctor down the hallway. When he entered the room, he saw Sharon lying on the bed, her hair sticking to her forehead with sweat, her eyes tired but shining. In her arms, a small bundle moved softly, and a faint sound escaped from the blankets. Jason hesitated at the door. He didn't want to interrupt that moment. Sharon looked up at him. When she saw him, she smiled. "Hey," she murmured, her voice weak. He took a few steps closer. His eyes went directly to the baby, and something stirred inside him in a way he hadn't expected. "He's beautiful," he said in almost a reverent tone. Sharon looked at the baby, her eyes brimming with tears. "Yeah, he is." For a moment, they both just looked at the little being that now existed between them. Then, Sharon raised her eyes again, this time focusing on him. At that moment, she realized that Jason was not just the man who helped her that night. He wasn't just a trucker who stopped to give a ride to a woman in need. There was something more there, something that had formed in the silence of the road, in the desperate race to the hospital, in the way he stayed by her side until the end. He could have left as soon as he dropped her off at the hospital, but he didn't. He stayed, he waited, he cared. What happened that night was not just an act of solidarity. It was the beginning of an unexpected connection, of something genuine and real. Jason looked at her again, and Sharon saw a different spark in his eyes. He seemed like he wanted to say something, but hesitated. I'm glad everything turned out okay," he said finally. She nodded slowly, holding the tiny hand of the baby. He hesitated for a moment before stepping back. "I should let you rest." "Jason." He stopped at the door and turned. Sharon opened her mouth to say something, but then just smiled. "Thank you." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded, exiting the room in silence. When the door closed, Sharon let out a long sigh. The baby was still sleeping in her arms, his small, serene face oblivious to everything that had happened in the last few hours. She looked at him, and for a moment felt the enormous responsibility she now carried. Her son depended solely on her. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel completely alone. In the following days, she expected Jason to disappear. After all, he had done more than anyone else would have. He stopped on that road, helped her when she needed it most, and waited at the hospital until everything was okay. Any other person would have just kept going, but Jason came back. On the second day after the birth, Sharon was sitting on the hospital bed, cradled by exhaustion, when she heard a soft knock at the door. "Can I come in?" It was his voice. She looked up, surprised, but smiled slightly. "What are you still doing here?" Jason entered, holding a brown paper bag. "I thought you might need a decent cup of coffee." Sharon raised an eyebrow as she took the hot cup he extended. "So now you're a coffee delivery guy?" He smiled wryly and pulled up a chair, sitting next to her. "Let's just say I started to care about you." She watched him for a moment, trying to understand. "Why?" Jason looked away for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "Because I saw how you were alone on that road. And then, hearing your story, I realized you've spent your whole life without anyone by your side." He looked back at her, his expression sincere. "No one deserves to go through everything alone." Her words hit her unexpectedly. "You didn't have to do this," she murmured. He shrugged. "I know, but I wanted to." And it wasn't just that day. Jason came back the next day. This time, he brought fruit and a soft blanket for the baby. The next day he showed up again, empty-handed, just asking if she needed anything. Sharon didn't completely understand the reason, but she didn't complain. For the first time, someone was there without her needing to ask. And then came the day of her discharge. When a nurse came into the room to tell her she could go home, she felt the weight of reality crash down on her shoulders. How would she go back? There was no family waiting for her, no one to pick her up. Maybe a taxi, maybe, but as if sensing her concern, Jason appeared at the door. "Ready to go home?" She blinked, confused. "You're still here?" He smiled. "I told you I wouldn't leave you alone." Sharon hesitated. She didn't want to be a burden to him, but the truth was, she was exhausted, and the idea of dealing with everything alone right after childbirth felt overwhelming. In the end, she nodded. "Thank you, Jason." He carried her few things to the truck, helping her get in with great care. When Sharon settled into the seat, with the baby protected in her arms, she glanced at him. "You didn't have to do this," she said, repeating her earlier words. Jason smiled faintly. "I know." The drive was silent. He drove calmly, unlike the last time when they had to race against time. Sharon felt strangely comfortable beside him. They didn't talk much, but there was something reassuring about his presence. When they reached her house, Jason got out and opened the truck door to help her down. She paused at the entrance, looking at the small space she called home. For the first time, she was returning home with someone by her side. "Do you want to come in for coffee?" she asked, hesitantly. Jason thought for a moment, but shook his head. "Not this time, but I'll be back to check how you're doing." Sharon nodded, and he came back. In the days that followed, Jason would show up to see if she needed anything. He'd bring little things, fresh bread from the bakery, any medicine she might need, even a thermos with hot tea. He never invaded her space, never stayed longer than necessary. He'd just ask how she was and leave. Then one day, he showed up empty-handed, just standing at the door. "I wanted to introduce you to my family." Sharon blinked, surprised. "Why?" He crossed his arms, thinking, "Because I want you to meet good people. I want you to see that there are bonds that don't need to be by blood to be real." She hesitated. She'd never felt comfortable invading someone else's space, but deep down, she was curious. So, she agreed. When they arrived at Jason's house, Sharon felt a flutter in her stomach. She didn't know what to expect. But as soon as the door opened, she was greeted by a different kind of warmth. Jason's wife looked at her with a genuine smile. "Finally, I meet you," she said warmly. Jason's two young, energetic kids approached curiously. "This is the baby?" the older one asked, pointing. Sharon smiled. "Yes, this is my son." Jason's wife took something from the table and handed it to her, a small handmade blanket. "I made this for him," she said. "I hope you like it." Sharon felt her eyes water. "Thank you." The night passed with easy conversation. They treated her as though she was already part of the family. There was no hesitation, no distance. And that night, Sharon realized something. It wasn't just a simple act of help. It wasn't just gratitude. It wasn't just a favor returned. It was friendship. It was care. It was something that fate, in some mysterious way, had placed in her path when she needed it most. For the first time in a long time, Sharon no longer felt completely alone. Not just because she had her son in her arms, but because she knew that from then on, she would have someone by her side. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.